Israel at War, The View from Israel. I'm Barry Shaw. I'll ask you a question. Is there any justice for dead Jews? Can dead Jews ever receive judgment and justice anywhere? This is an issue that has been troubling me for some time. And to help me through this conundrum, I brought on a very special guest, friend of mine, Lieutenant Colonel retired Maurice Hirsch, who is the director of the Initiative for Palestinian Authority Accountability and Reform at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Maurice, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Barry.
Right, Maurice, you were also the former director of military prosecution for Judea and Samaria. That was basically bringing arrested terrorists to judgment. Give me and our audience a bit of background of what your job's there. What was it? What did it entail? What sort of court system did they go through, and what form of justice was delivered?
So, Barry, in different cycles of my career in the army, I was in charge really of prosecuting Palestinian terrorists who had been arrested by the Israeli forces. Up until 2005, that task also included the prosecution of terrorists from Gaza, and then with the disengagement and Israel's retreat from Gaza, so the courts there were closed. In Judea and Samaria, it meant prosecuting pretty much all, 95%, I would say 95%, 97% of the terrorists that were active in Israel, in Judea and Samaria. In many occasions, the terrorists that stood trial in the courts in Judea and Samaria were those that had carried out terrorist attacks also in Israel, sending their suicide bombers to blow up in restaurants, buses, hotels, and wherever they may find Jews to wholesale murder.
Tell me, in your time in that duty, somebody like Yahya Sinwar, when he was arrested, was that before your time or when you were a military prosecutor?
No, so Yahya Sinwar was arrested and prosecuted before I joined the IDF. He was a terrorist in Gaza. He was famous for setting up Hamas's internal security division, which means that he took Palestinians who he suspected of being collaborators with Israel and murdered them, as well as torturing them, and also participated in carrying out attacks against Israelis. But that was before already that I joined the army. So he was already in prison, serving multiple life sentences already then.
All right, I'll come to Yahya Sinwar a bit later in the program, but I assume that you were the Palestinian terrorists were on trial in a military court, and that the terror victims and their families were not represented at this, or us as witnesses at the court hearing.
So that to a great extent is representative of the picture. In many cases, the fact that it's a military court didn't make any difference really whatsoever. It's the same rules of evidence, it's the same rules of procedure. Just that the law in Israel, which provided the victims, the families of the victims with rights within the legal process, was never actually applied to Judea and Samaria and was never applied in the courts. That's something which I personally dealt with when I assumed my position as head of the prosecution in 2013. I decided that that was something which was no longer acceptable, and therefore, even without the law, I started providing the connection between the prosecution and the victims immediately once the terrorists had been arrested, so that we would be in contact with the families, that never again would we be in a situation where the families of victims found out about judgments against the terrorists simply from the news. That was something which to a certain extent was a little bit of a rogue activity of mine, one that I'm obviously quite proud of in the circumstances. And now since then, the law has actually been amended and adopted. And now the groundwork that I laid already as the head of the prosecution is now the standard practice. But you have to distinguish, Barry, between people who are families of the victims and who just, without in any way really understating their importance, who are just families of the victims, but cannot actually contribute to the trial itself. They don't really know what happened. They weren't present at the scene of the event, and therefore they are not relevant as witnesses in the actual trial. And then there are those family victims who were together with the other victims at the same time. For example, the Schnurb family. The Schnurb family, you remember, a PFLP bomb that was exploded in August 2019. The terrorists murdered Rina Schnurb, but together with her, injured at the same time, were her father, Rav Eitan, and her brother, Dvir. So they were severely injured at the time. So they are not only part of that wider circle of families of the victim, but they are victims themselves. So we actually, with the prosecution, we worked out a way where they would give testimony already at the beginning of the trial. That meant that they would be allowed to participate in the rest of the trial, even as spectators, as well as at the end of the line, giving evidence as to the damage that had been caused by the terrorists and potential damage claims. Other victims, unfortunately, are left almost by the wayside. They are not relevant for the main part of the trial, which is really the clarification of exactly what were the factual development of the terror attack and its commission. And so if you're not integrally involved in that situation and you don't have first-hand information to contribute, then as possibly as cold-hearted as it sounds, the families of the victims don't really have that much to contribute at that stage of the trial.
Yeah, I must admit to you, Maurice, this is something that I've had a frustrated experience and history on when I tried to help bring justice. I'm not a lawyer, for the families of the terror victims in my hometown of Netanya, which was suffered a really malicious form of Palestinian terrorism. I'm referring to a string of, for instance, 6 suicide attacks culminating in the Passover massacre at the Park Hotel. And we found it impossible to find a forum, a court in Israel or anywhere else to hear the plaintiffs, some of the survivors, compensation for the people, the families of those that were murdered. Basically, a suicide bomber, you're dead. There's nobody to bring to court. And I really believe that Israeli terror victims have really never had their day in court. And I want to talk to you a bit about the unique nature of what we experienced here on the 7th of October. But before I do that, I want to ask you, is the Israeli military court the only avenue to bring captured Hamas terrorists or some of their leaders to justice? And the other thing, I want to ask you this, because basically they're not coming here as prisoners of war because they don't fight in uniform and not for any official army. So they shouldn't have any sort of protection of a prisoner of war, and their act is totally criminal. Am I correct?
Yes, Barry, you're 100% on that front. The terrorists from Gaza who infiltrated Israel on the 7th of October are simply terrorists. They do not in any way, shape or form meet the requirements of being a legitimate soldier, and therefore they do not enjoy any of the rights that would be pursuant to that status as set down in the 3rd Geneva Convention. As regards the courts, the military courts that were operative in Judea and Samaria are different and separate from the civilian courts in Israel. In Israel, we used to have a military court also for prosecuting terrorists. It was a remnant of the British Mandate period, but those courts really closed in the late 90s, the mid to late 90s. I was actually part of that decision to close those courts under the understanding that in Israel is a developed modern democracy. In modern democracies, you do not have military courts that will try civilians, and so that's not something which is obviously desirable. Separate, obviously, from Judea and Samaria, there the courts were operating in accordance with international law because Israel hadn't applied its civilian law to those areas, and therefore the understanding is that in areas such as Judea and Samaria, the relevant provisions would be that you set up military courts, non-political military courts. So in Israel, for the prosecution of the terrorists who infiltrated on the 7th of October. And here, just a word of caution, Barry. Everyone is talking about the terrorists being from Hamas. They were not only from Hamas. There were Hamas terrorists. There were Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists. There were terrorists from Fatah. Mahmoud Abbas's party, Fatah. They participated in the October 7th massacre. Other terrorists who participated were from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, a member organization in the PLO, the umbrella organization of what they call Palestinian factions, that's also headed by Mahmoud Abbas. They have been one of the rejectionist organizations ever since the signing of the Oslo Accords. They deny Israel's right to exist, and yet they are still a member of this organization that pretends to have signed a peace agreement with Israel. All of these and other terrorist organizations participated in the October 7 massacre, and it is wrong to only assume or to argue that it was only Hamas. The spectrum was much wider and should be understood as much wider, also in the context of, well, it wasn't only the Islamic fundamentalists who were killing Jews on the 7th of October, but it was also the ostensibly moderate PLO, PA, Fatah, who were participating in that mass slaughter of the Jews.
Yeah. Look, I mentioned Yahya Sinwar earlier on, and I mentioned it for a reason. Yahya Sinwar was one of the Hamas terrorists who was captured and imprisoned, and he was later exchanged with a large number of Hamas and other terrorists in exchange for a single soldier, Gilad Shalit, who had been taken hostage. Yahya Sinwar, as you and I know, has risen in the ranks and has become a public enemy number one, target number one. He is the head, the operating head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip right now as we speak. So I want to ask you, is this really justice where we simply put Hamas prisoners in jail, feed them, home them, entertain them, or whatever until some sort of hostage release is made and released, or they reach the end of the sentence and they go out and start reintroducing terrorists even on a larger scale? Is this really justice?
No, Barry, it's definitely not justice. There's no idea of justice in any of this process. The Palestinians, we have to remember, literally celebrate 43 different instances in which Israel has released thousands of terrorists, many of them convicted for murders, multiple murders, mass terrorist attacks, all the way through the years. They obviously intensified much more so during the Oslo period, where thousands of terrorists were released, also just as part of this ongoing so-called peace process, where really those terrorists went back out, they were released and then carried on murdering Jews. The incident for the release of Gilad Shalit obviously has been an absolutely disastrous consequence. Not only Yahya Sinwar, but even before the October 7th massacre, there had been over 15 Israelis murdered by terrorists who were released in the Oslo as part of the deal to free Gilad Shalit. And now not only Yahya Sinwar was instrumental in the attack, but also many others from much lower levels. For example, Ali Qadri was the platoon commander of the Nukhba forces. That's the Hamas commando forces for the central area. He was also previously arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his employee, Sasson Nouriel, who he murdered in 2005, and actually broadcast live his execution. He was also one of these senior members of the Hamas forces participating in the attack. Now, he obviously received what I would believe is the only just punishment for him, and he was taken out, neutralized, killed in a strategic attack. So I think that really is the only justice that can be found here. I am a proponent for these terrorists of the death sentence. I do not believe that it is possible to deter them simply with life sentences, because they have the experience of Israel constantly allowing terrorists to be released. So there is no deterrence in the life sentence. There's more hope that Israel will again, for one reason or another, release the terrorists. So that completely undermines that idea of deterrence.
Talk to me, if you would, about the proposal I understood that you brought to the new Israeli government after the November election about sentencing for terrorists that included the death sentence or deportation. Talk to me about the pros and cons of that proposal.
So I've been involved over the years, Barry, in trying to promote the idea of the death sentence. I believe that just when you see the numbers of Palestinian terrorists who simply, when the Israeli forces come to arrest them, they do not fight until they're killed. They simply give themselves up. They surrender because they believe that they will be able to get out and then live another day to kill more Jews. So I have been a proponent of the death sentence for terrorists for a very long time. When, as the head of the prosecution for Judea and Samaria, just after the three teenage Israelis were kidnapped and murdered in 2014, I already prepared a recommendation to ask for the death sentence for the two main terrorists who were involved there. Luckily, they did actually fight out till the end and were killed, so it became irrelevant. But that's something which needs to be promoted. Now, Israel has a long history with the death sentence. It's something which has only been applied in Israel in two instances. One, I would say successfully, the case of Adolf Eichmann, the famous Nazi, and the other was a case of a guy called Tubiansky. And now this case of Tubiansky has left Israel with a national trauma. Tubiansky was a soldier, an officer in the IDF. He was suspected of having given intelligence information to the enemy during Israel's War of Independence, and was summarily tried, court-martialed, and sentenced to death. The sentence was carried out, and it later became apparent that he was innocent of the crime for which he had been committed. And this is something which has been traumatic for Israel all the way along. When you then add on the component of Jewish religious law, of halacha, that says that in order to put a Jew to death for a crime, a capital punishment, you need very, very stringent requirements. So how do you then say that that non-Jews will possibly be able to be subject to the death sentence, whereas Jews will not? It's a complicated mechanism that needs to be created there within the system, because unfortunately, obviously, we do have some Jews who are involved in terrorism, and obviously that it's condemned from every perspective. But it's part of that complicating factor. The suggestion that I've made in the past is that the death sentence should be applied to anyone who comes from abroad, comes from outside of Israel, and attacks Israelis and murders Israelis, as we saw on the events of the 7th of October. And that would be a way to better understand and to ensure that the law and the application of the death sentence would be much clearer. It would potentially also apply, obviously, to the terrorists in Judea and Samaria coming into Israel and carrying out their attacks. The military courts are obviously separate in their nature, so it wouldn't necessarily be a limitation there. That's already something which is part of the wider discussion of why military courts, when military courts, who stands trial before the military courts. We would obviously, in that equation, have to take into account that there would be Arab terrorists responsible for terror attacks who are Israeli citizens who would not be relevant for the death sentence. But I think that that's a price that Israel should be willing to pay.
Before I progress on to different forms of justice, I want to ask you, Morris, about a personal dilemma that I have. And that is the question, when does a civilian lose a civilian status? What I'm talking about is aiding and abetting the enemy. And I'll give you some brief examples. Whenever I watch, for instance, the IDF going into areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority, like Jenin, or places like this, in order to arrest Hamas terrorists or other terrorists, we know where they are. We're going in to arrest them. And they're interfered with in their arrest attempts by civilians putting things on the road to block the progress of the IDF, throwing rocks at the IDF, even throwing explosives at the IDF. That's one example. The other example that sickens me has been hearing about the poor Palestinian civilians in Gaza, when we have seen scenes of inordinate amounts of civilians coming out celebrating the Hamas terrorists who were returning to Gaza with their Israeli hostages, including children, girls and everything. And they're either grabbing on, spitting on the bodies or the hostages themselves, or attempting to beat them or grab them or whatever. When does a civilian lose that status as a non-combatant, if you like?
So really the answer to that, Barry, it comes from international law, which really does identify three separate categories of people. On the one hand, you have soldiers. Soldiers enjoy the protections of international law, of the Third Geneva Convention, prisoners of war. Soldiers are legitimate targets, and they can be attacked at any stage of the fighting. Obviously, you have the four main principles of targeting there and of international humanitarian law, of the laws of war. We won't get into that. So that's one category. On the other hand, you have civilians. Civilians are exempt from attack. They are outside of the scope of the conflict, in as much as you cannot intentionally, and that is the crux of the issue. You cannot intentionally target civilians. If you attack a military target and there are civilians in the proximity and the civilians are killed, that isn't a war crime. That is just something that's called collateral damage. It's an equation of the function of proportionality in international law, which says that every military commander, when he goes to consider every attack on a legitimate target, should also consider whether the direct advantage being achieved is disproportionate to the civilian casualties that will be caused. And that's really the equation that he has to put into his mind. And so you have those two categories: civilians on the one hand and soldiers on the other. Then you have this middle category. The middle category is defined as direct participants in hostilities. You're not a soldier. You're a civilian who takes up arms. Now, this definition is very, very wide and has very, very severe implications. A direct participant in hostilities, a DPH as they're known, is a legitimate target as if he is a soldier. Now, how wide is that? Let me give you an example. There was recently an international law symposium on the war in Russia, between Russia and the Ukraine. One of the things implemented by the Ukrainian government was an app, simply an app, which every Ukrainian who wanted to could download the app and be party to reporting on the movements of the Russian troops into the Ukraine. Now, the question is, well, if that directly contributes to the Ukrainian war effort, are those people then considered to be DPHs, direct participants in the hostilities? The implication and being that if they are, then they are legitimate targets for the Russian army and can be killed. And the answer given as part of this conference, Barry, with all of the international really support for Ukraine and understanding that the Russian aggression was illegitimate and the Russians are committing war crimes, the understanding of all of the participants in the symposium was that simply reporting on the movements of the enemy forces turns that person reporting into a DPH. So if merely reporting on the movements of the enemy's forces can turn you into a legitimate target, certainly, Barry, all of the examples that you gave before, those who place obstacles in the way of the advancing forces, those who attack clearly the advancing forces, simply those who report on the movements of the advancing IDF forces. And here, Barry, I can maybe refer you to a study done by one of my colleagues at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, by Lenny Ben David, who talked about the phenomenon of the terrorists specifically using, just understand this, young Palestinian girls as spotters. They are the ones who are being sent out to report on the movements of the Israeli forces. They, on the one hand, clearly are DPHs and can be legitimately targeted, but the Palestinians and the terrorists use them intentionally and with malice aforethought to as cannon fodder, because when they're killed, they then use them as, oh, look at the evilness of the Israeli army targeting innocent Palestinian little girls. So really, they have a win-win situation. They get the information, and if their cannon fodder is killed, they can use them as part of the propaganda warfare. So really, the scope is very wide. Now, on the one hand. On the other hand, Barry, we still do need to distinguish between those who are participating and those people who are morally defunct, those people who have lost their basic image as a human being and are able to celebrate and enjoy and spit on the bodies of the Israelis murdered and kidnapped and taken hostage by the terrorists. Those people are just disgusting human beings. They aren't necessarily DPHs, and that has to be understood.
Maurice, I want to add another element of the need for justice into this. And this is, I'm talking about the leaders of Hamas. I'm not talking about the Sinwars who were in the Gaza Strip, although he needfully arranged for his family to leave a few days before October the 7th. I'm talking about the leaders of Hamas who are leading luxury lives in Doha or in other places like Turkey or whatever, and seem to be immune from any judgment or any justice. In fact, we saw, I don't know if the world saw it, we saw it on our Israeli television screens, about the leaders of Hamas, including the leaders in Doha, who were watching on a large screen TV, the Hamas terrorists setting out from Gaza, breaching the fence, and they all went on their knees to pray to Allah for the success of the mission. And yet these people are immune. You have the leader of Hamas, who is known to have a personal fortune of $4 billion, and he also has a super yacht and a private jet, and yet they seem to be immune from justice. These are the people that gave the orders. How do we deliver these people for the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that they are responsible for? I'm going to ask you about the International Criminal Court. And I know, Maurice, because we know each other, you're quite cynical of bringing terror leaders like this, who are responsible for October 7th and everything that's happened since, to justice.
So let me answer that question on the two fronts. Firstly, let's start maybe with the end, the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court, Barry, and we have to understand it, is a joke. It is a joke. There is no nice way to put that. There is no diplomatic way to put that. In 2021, the International Criminal Court invented a state that does not exist, provided it with borders that international agreements say would never be considered as borders, and all that with the specific and sole goal of persecuting the Jewish state, of persecuting Jews for defending themselves against these homicidal terrorists. That is not a real court. That is a monkey court and should not be relied upon. I wrote immediately after the October 7th massacre that the idea of submitting complaints to the International Criminal Court should immediately be taken off the agenda. It is something that will be used by the courts cynically only in order to say, well, look, we were open-handed. We considered the complaints of the Jews against these homicidal terrorists, but now we haven't found any of them, so we're moving on with our even-handedness of, well, there's problems on both sides, so we're just going to prosecute the Jews. That's what will happen there. Nothing good will come out of the International Criminal Court. We saw, unfortunately, the prosecutor, Karim Khan, visiting Gaza and spreading more of his, well, whataboutism and moral equivalency. The terrorists murdered people in a supernova nature party, but Israel has been bombing and there have been civilians killed, and so that is clearly problematic. This moral deficiency is something which has accompanied the court from its outset, and nothing, and I can't stress this enough, nothing good will come from the International Criminal Court. As we've seen, they were quick to move on Russia and the Ukraine. There were arrest warrants already put out for Putin for his policy of kidnapping children. In Gaza, the terrorists are holding dozens of children. Everybody knows about it. The world knows about it. It is unequivocal. The court has done nothing. It will do nothing. And even if it does give that piecemeal support of saying, well, we're considering putting out arrest warrants, I don't think that will be anything even close to what really should happen to them. And that brings me on to the second point. Justice for Israel, justice for the victims of the October 7 massacre will not be found in these international criminal court arenas. What Israel needs to do, and I say this with a full heart and without reservation, is to implement the same policy that Israel adopted following the massacre of the murder of the Israeli Olympians in 1972 in Munich. Israel needs to send its forces, trained forces, and simply eliminate, execute the Hamas leaders wherever they are around the world. That should be the clearest message for all of these people. There is nowhere safe for you. In the same way as the Black September terrorists were hunted, these people need to be hunted and executed for their crimes. And that is what the Israeli government should and needs to be doing.
I sense in your voice, Morris, somebody who's dedicated his life to law and justice, the sheer frustration of what you said. And basically where the failure of the International Criminal Court, who is basically there, if you like, together with the United Nations, is to hunt for war crimes that they can bring against Israel, but not against those that perpetrate crimes against Israeli Jews. Even in the international nature of what happened on the 7th of October, there were citizens of 30 countries who were killed on the 7th of November or still lying as hostages. And yet the International Criminal Court will not address it seriously because they're too busy hunting for Israel. I share your frustration.
They just don't, excuse my language, they just don't give a damn. They have unequivocal evidence. They've had unequivocal evidence for over, since the court started interfering illegitimately in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They know unequivocally that the Palestinian Authority has an entrenched system where they pay financial rewards and incentives to terrorists for murdering Jews. They know that this is a call for genocide. They know that this is a war crime. The evidence is really unequivocal. The Palestinian Authority has admitted it in affidavits in court. They have a law. Mahmoud Abbas says time after time that even if he's left with one penny, 1 cent in the coffers of the Palestinian Authority, he will use it to pay the terrorists first, not the sick, not the elderly, not the welfare cases, to pay terrorists. That is a clear war crime. Have you seen in the last 5 years the International Criminal Court issuing an arrest warrant for Mahmoud Abbas? Absolutely not. Even on that most basic level, this court is a joke, a farce, and is not doing its job. All they're interested in is prosecuting Jews and nothing else. And everyone else can do whatever they want. They can murder Jews. They can reward people for murdering Jews. They can have an institutional policy of rewarding people. Imagine, Barry, what would happen if you were to say, I'm going to put into law an institutionalized system where you get paid a reward for murdering black people. The world would be up in arms. That's hideous racism. And obviously, that's something which cannot be accepted. But there is such a system regarded in the Palestinian Authority for the murder of Jews, and the world is quiet. The prosecutor in the criminal court is silent. There are no arrest warrants. There are no proceedings against Mahmoud Abbas anywhere to be seen on the horizon, only searching for Jews.
Morris, I hear that the Justice Ministry is working on establishing some sort of ad hoc special war crimes tribunal, similar to the Nuremberg trials of World War II. In fact, a former Israeli judge, Stephen Adler, justified this tribunal. And again, I repeat, the enormity and the horror inflicted on Israelis and people, as I said before, from 30 countries on 7th of October demands such a precedent. What do you have to say to that?
So, Barry, I'm not sure that we actually need a specific new forum in order to prosecute the terrorists. I think that we need a new law. I think the law that needs to be passed in the same way as Israel implemented a new law for the prosecution of Nazi war criminals. That said that if you were active as a Nazi, in part of the extermination of the Jews during the Holocaust, then you would be subject to prosecution for these crimes, and justice would be served in that manner. That's the same legislation that Adolf Eichmann stood trial based on that legislation, and similarly Ivan Demjanjuk many years later. So that is the situation that we have. Unfortunately, that law is time limited to the period of the Nazi rule in Germany and in Europe. So it's not relevant for today. What we have at the moment, and no military tribunal will be any different on this count, is our regular criminal law, which has offences like murder and rape and arson, all of these things that the terrorists did on the 7th of October. But I'm sure you'll agree with me, Barry, that it's not really relevant to take someone who raped and murdered people in their houses and burnt them as part of this idea of carrying out the genocidal policy of the terrorists in the Gaza Strip and say, well, you know what, I'm going to prosecute you for the offense of murder. Now, I don't take the offense of murder lightly, but it doesn't encompass in that murder the severity, the loss of all type of humanity that was encompassed in those actions. And therefore, I believe that the Israeli civilian courts can deal with this, the subject, but we need to ensure that the basic laws on which they operate are made relevant for the trials and can properly express the disgust of human society, of all humanity, from the events that took place there. They would also have to take away, for example, all types of other limitations within the criminal system. We had, as we mentioned in the beginning, the terrorists attacked some 30 different sites along the border. This was an organized, coordinated attack, but from the point of view of criminal law, not all of them were party to the original planning. They were just sent, you're going to X place. Now, can you, based on that, then create the partnership that is needed between the different co-conspirators in order to say that every one of these terrorists is responsible for the actions of all of the others? They weren't physically present at the other sites. And so this creates an entire spectrum of questions that could potentially be raised if we were to continue on with this path of the regular Israeli criminal law. This is a separate question from which court. The Israeli civilian court judges could be appointed to the bench in the regular courts that we have already. They would just sit in an open public forum in the same way as the Eichmann trial was publicly broadcast. These trials could also be publicly broadcast. They would run every single day, day after day after day after day, until the trials are finished. And that's something which I think would be much preferable over creating a new instance, a new level of court, which obviously it can't be ruled out and isn't necessarily a priori something which is undesirable. I just believe that it's not something which is necessary at the moment.
Well, let me try and stress the thing. if this special tribunal was a form of a new court, a unique court, once use, once only, not a standard introduction, new form of justice in Israel, as basically to have it as a televised open show trial in which the prosecutors will produce the murderers and cross-examine them. These have already been, as you and I know, have been interrogated by the Shabak and have admitted murders and everything. But it would also be an educational thing, because as with the Eichmann trial, you can produce witnesses who witness these things to give their evidence to the judges over there. And basically what this would lead to, I think, would lead to implicate the leaders, that these animals that invaded us in their thousands on the 7th of October were simply the foot soldiers, not just for the Yahya Sinwars, but the leaders in Doha and Turkey and whatever. And part of the judgment, I would hope, would be that the prosecutors would call for the arrest of the Hamas leaders who were sent these people to do such awful, awful crimes. And why it should be an open trial as well, because this isn't restricted just to Israelis. Or for instance, the Eichmann trial was restricted, if you like, for Israelis and Jews. I repeat the claim that there were people from 30 nations that were slaughtered on that day. So I would have thought that a lot of nations abroad would identify about this. And the importance of the show trial, which would be shown on TV everywhere in every country, would lead to the embarrassment and the arrest of the Hamas leaders who are living in luxury in places like Doha. Let me, before you answer that, let me just come on, and I'm going to quote, and I made it a note here. I remember the words, and I wrote it down here, who was the chief prosecutor at the Eichmann trial, Gideon Hausner, who said to the judges, I stand before you, the judges of Israel, not alone, but I stand as 6 million prosecutors. In this case, the chief prosecutor would stand as a prosecutor of 9 million Israelis, but also as a prosecutor on behalf of the victims from 30 other countries.
Without question, Barry, this would be something which I think is really, it would be somewhat of a derogation from what Israel generally does. Israel doesn't usually show cases, definitely not criminal cases, and broadcast them around the world. But I think that as part of this process, some of that evidence, some of those witnesses, it would have very, very clear benefits to show them around the world. Again, trials are, as I'm sure much of your audience is familiar, trials are long and complicated. There are initial arguments and movements and motions that are made, which really aren't particularly interesting along the way. And in many cases, even when you get to the trial itself, the prosecution would like to bring the terrorists and have them tell their stories and cross-examine them. But in many cases, the defense lawyers aren't interested in their clients really taking the stand and telling without any type of remorse, without any type of shame, the acts that they carried out, clearly understanding that actually the terrorists telling the truth would be prejudicial, which is why you see such a high number of plea bargains in cases of terrorism around the world, because the terrorists, they're strong when they're attacking civilians. They are less strong, obviously, when they have to stand trial and pay the price of their depravity, and then they hide behind the legal process. So I'm not sure to what extent we would see these hundreds of terrorists who have been arrested. Some of them have admitted during their interrogation to raping, murdering, beheading. How many of them would actually then take the stand and say, well, yes, this is what I did? On the one hand, I think the other cautionary note that has to be made, Barry, and this is really part of the limitations of regular criminal law. To what extent are these animals, really animals who participated in the October 7 massacre, to what extent do they have any connection let alone a direct connection to Yahya Sinwar. Of the 100 people who were arrested, 100 odd people arrested at the scene of the crime, we don't know how many of them had a direct connection to Yahya Sinwar. It could be that there were none of them, that none of them could directly implicate and then give a solid evidentiary basis to the involvement of Sinwar in the attack. Would that in any way detract from his responsibility for the attack? I would say no. But criminal law sometimes gives you this understanding that you have real objective fact and then you have criminal law fact. Sometimes the two don't mix together. For example, we know that people were raped and beheaded. But let's say, for argument's sake, that there was none of the live terrorists who had participated in those events. So Israel actually managed to kill most of them. Let's add that in. So when you write the indictment, in an indictment, you're going to put in the facts that you then hope to prove. Now, if you don't have to prove the fact that someone was raped because you have no defendant that it's relevant for them, then why would you go down that path in the first place? So if you don't include the fact that people were raped in the indictment, does that mean that it didn't happen? Absolutely not. It just means that there is potentially no relevant defendant that it would be even part of the narrative worthwhile to put it in. So there are all types of different considerations that have to be taken into account within this wider context, and something which isn't necessarily entirely intuitive to anyone who's watching or reading about what's going on. So again, the show trial would be important, but has to be understood that it has its limitations.
Okay, part of my answer to that, Morris, was this, that actually in the Eichmann trial, Eichmann never admitted that he was responsible for the murder of 6 million Jews. He talked about his mitigating circumstances. And I'm sure in such a trial like this, where they were talking about Sinwar, which I hope he won't be able to come to trial because he'll be dead, but certainly people like Ismail Haniyeh and the leaders in Doha would know about the attacks. And I suppose if they were brought to trial, they would say, well, we never told the people to rape and behead children or whatever. But they're the ones that sent the murderers into Israel to kill in any case. So the fact that, Sinwar or Haniyeh would say, well, I never told them to do this, is really not a defense and not a reason not to bring them to trial. Which basically brings me, I guess, Morris, to my final question. You and I know
just on that note, Barry, before you go on, I just want to give the audience an understanding of what we just said. If you had the 9/11 bombers, right, they were all killed in the attacks. You have none of them that could directly connect them to Osama bin Laden. Does that mean that Osama bin Laden wasn't responsible for the 9/11 attacks? Clearly, the answer is no. But just to conceptualize it, that people understand the difference between those two things, again, is I think very important.
Right. Okay. Fair point. I agree. The final point I want to ask you is really based on what we know over here. You know about Yael Waldman, who was the founder of Mellanox, billionaire, high tech. He gave loads of employment for a lot of people in Gaza or whatever, probably regretting it now. But his daughter and her boyfriend were murdered at the Nova dance festival. And he has called for the international arrest warrant for Hamas leaders on genocide and war crime charges. And he has the money. And he also has international clout because of his connection to make waves, which simple folks like me are unable to do. What do you think his chances are? And what would the process be in bringing international arrest warrants for Hamas leaders who are held up in either Istanbul or in Doha?
So I think obviously the process is something which is known. A court would have to arrest, would have to issue a warrant for their arrest. The International Criminal Court, as I said, there have been different reports just in the last few days of what's going on there, with 5 different countries asking the prosecutor to get involved. Djibouti and Bangladesh and South Africa, that are all fundamentally anti-Israel, demanding that the prosecutor move forward there with the investigation of the war crimes committed by Israel. Then you had a meeting of the prosecutor with some of the victims of the October 7 massacre, the Israelis, where unfortunately I don't believe any bona fides in his actions, where he apparently even shed a tear for the victims. Well, that's all very nice and well and good, but he actually hasn't done anything against since he came into his position, as I said before, against Mahmoud Abbas for clear, open breaches of international law and for rewarding and incentivizing the murder of Jews. So I don't believe that there's any bona fides behind that. That would be the process, though, using that influence to put out arrest warrants. Would it make any difference? Absolutely not. You have countries like Qatar who are supportive of the terror. They are supportive. They have been supporting Hamas to the tune of $30 million a month for the last 5 years. They have hosted these people for many years, knowing that they are terrorists. They don't really care. They're allowing them a safe haven. And so if you had an international arrest warrant against them, they wouldn't really care. And the countries hosting them wouldn't really care. What would they do? They'll go to Iran. Do you think Iran really gives a damn about what Karim Khan or the International Criminal Court thinks about their actions? Absolutely not.
Well, I don't believe, for instance, the United Nations Security Council would ever pass anything to order Qatar to hand over the Hamas leaders, simply because, quite frankly, the United States would never use a veto, because the United States are renting military bases in Qatar. And the United States are also allowing Qatar to spend billions, with a B, of dollars to bring indoctrination onto the American campuses. And we've seen the result of that with the enormous rise of anti-Semitism that's going on in America right now. So I tend to share your negative and jaundiced approach about which comes as an answer to my question. Is it possible for dead Jews or even live Jews to receive justice anywhere in the world? How would you sum up?
Absolutely not. The Europeans at the moment are, at least since the start of the war between Russia and the Ukraine, the Europeans are entirely dependent on the Qatari gas. They are going to do nothing against Qatar. Anyone who says that you can really influence Qatar or leverage Qatar into denying safe haven for these terrorists simply doesn't understand the extent of the world's now reliance, definitely Europe's reliance on Qatar, on its gas, on its energy system, especially now going into another winter without the Russian gas because of the Ukrainian war. And so that idea of putting any type of pressure on Qatar is just a non-starter, and really it's given to placate people, as if to say, yeah, we're trying to do something. No, they're not. They're not seeking justice for Jews. All they're seeking justice for is how they fill their power stations with gas to support their people through a cold winter, and that is their main concern. A few Jews murdered by some uppity terrorists don't really interest them whatsoever, and so therefore the answer is only a strong Israel that eliminates the terrorists will ever be able to bring justice for Jewish victims of terror. Nothing else. We cannot rely on the international community. We cannot rely on, definitely not the UN. The UN is one of these most poisonous organizations. Hatred towards the Jew is an integral part of their very being. And so they are obviously not a source of any type of consolation or justice. And as much as it saddens me to say, the European countries are far too self-involved with their own interests, as is America to a not a small extent, and therefore we can only rely on ourselves. Whoever we do not deliver justice to will not be subject to justice.
So, this is a sobering video for you out there watching this. I opened this video by asking, is there any justice for dead Jews? And you've just heard the expert opinion of one of the legal experts and military legal experts as well in Israel. The answer to the question, is there any justice for dead Jews, is simply, Jewish lives don't matter. This is Barry Shaw, The View from Israel.
אנו מכריזים בזאת